Go. Cool. And we're live. Alan, you mentioned, I'm actually kind of curious. You mentioned not having as much experience in front end. Do you have experience with Next.js, and do you look at that as front end? Because I think there's like traditional, I guess there's different interpretations now that like frameworks like Next.js kind of mix front end and back end all together. So do you look at that as more of a front endy tool that also does back end?
What is front end
I
and what is
know,
back
yeah.
end, right?
That's why it's hard.
Yeah. So I mean, the last kind of like major front end development that I did was when I was first building ngrok, I built like the front end in Angular actually, and then like
Angular, like
yeah,
JS or
yeah,
a
Angular
number JS. Okay, cool.
JS, yeah. I don't even remember. It was like it was so long ago, and it doesn't matter anymore. And then eventually, discovered that was a really bad idea, and then rewrote it in React.
Cool.
But still right. Like there are other things that we use TypeScript for at ngrok that are not front end things. We use that for some of our configuration and tooling. So I tend to write some of that as well. JavaScript and TypeScript occupy one of the interesting places in the ecosystem of being a language that you end up using in both the front end and the back end. At least for me, like I tend to think of front end as like browser side development, I suppose. And so if I'm saying front end, it's usually shorthand for that. So I actually had like a little demo that I can share that has like the beginnings of an Express app, but that's about as deep as I've gone into that piece of it. But relatively well acquainted with like TypeScript and JavaScript and some of the ecosystem tools around like building and compiling projects for it. Less so actually like building UIs, because I haven't touched that in a couple of years.
Yeah.
My React knowledge is like, I don't know, probably like 5 years dated at this point.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah, it's one, so like stuff on the front end just moves so quickly anyway, but then also you kind of touched on this, like the mixing and blending of front end and back end gets really interesting, and I feel like anyone that says they're front end versus back end versus full stack, I feel like it's worth clarifying at any point, like what does that actually mean to you, because of things like Next.js in particular, SvelteKit that I mentioned earlier, give you the mix of like you can do front end stuff, but you also have the core principles of back end where you can connect to databases and do API endpoints and do like logic and all that sort of stuff. Yeah, it's interesting.
It's one of the things that makes that ecosystem really unique, is that it's kind of, I mean, there are other folks who have like hacked together things that work in this way, but in terms of like truly building like a unified front end and back end experience and like working in the same tools for both of them, the JavaScript TypeScript world is kind of unique in that respect. There are some older technologies that kind of maybe did that. Google Web Toolkit, like the Java thing that they wrote like 8 or 10 years ago, used to have they like compiled Java into the browser and stuff like that. It's been a while since someone's like built that unified experience in anything except for JavaScript and TypeScript. Yeah. In a widely adopted way, that is.
Yeah. Nibby in the chat is asking about the Zeta stream. I don't know. Is she asking, or
is that what that's about?
And I said she, I don't actually know. Sorry. I don't know. Is that for Amy? Tomorrow? I don't have, I have one. Maybe it's for me. I have one next Thursday with Zeta.
Nice.
About AI. Maybe that's the one that they're asking.
Are you streaming with yourself, or do you have a?
Makes it sound so lonely that way. It's with Dom from Zeta. Demetrius.
Oh, fun.
Yeah.
Fun. So I sent him an invite to come on the podcast.
Oh, cool. Good. Yeah. He, one of my favorite people that I've met in person, and can't wait to hang out. Yeah. Nibby, next Thursday is that stream. It'll be at 12:30 Central Time, which is my time. So time zones, you'll have to figure out what that means for yours.
I feel so American when I'm like, this is my time zone.
I feel like I've got pretty good awareness of time zones now, because I've just worked with so many people internationally, but I don't have like every time zone difference memorized. But I know a pretty good amount. It's hard.
Oh man. Speaking of Zeta, I was streaming about it this morning and showing some of the features, and
Hmm.
Cyan God, who usually is in the chat, I was like, what?
Mhm. It's so cool. Have you, Alan, have you heard of Zeta before? Serverless database option?
I was just looking it up right now.
Cool.
Yeah, backend. That's interesting too. Backend as a service.
Hmm.
There's several products right now that do that for you.
Cool. This it feels vaguely Firebase parse, like that kind of like backend as a service, sort of a modern take on that, which is really nice to see.
There's a lot of cool features that they have in Zeta. I think it's kind of an underrated thing, I think, for me, for databases to have a UI associated with them, like to go and see your data, because usually with traditional databases, we go and build that kind of dashboard anyway. So it's just nice to have that kind of built in.
Yeah, that's I think like the folks in that world have been like, everyone has been thinking about like, at some level, like Excel is a database, right? But it is like the UI first one, and then as you've like moved to like Microsoft Access or like Airtable or like modern tools that start to like, there's this interesting continuum between that and like a SQL database, and we're like always like searching for something that's kind of like blending those pieces and technologies. So it's interesting to see like that the world is still like pushing the boundaries of like how far you can go in those directions.
And just in general, I think databases, it feels like recently that databases have kind of gotten a focus on modernization. Like so many things have changed in the development tool cycles, and databases seem to be making a lot of changes to kind of follow that. Like one with PlanetScale that Zeta also does is just branching. So you can branch your databases somewhat how you would branch your code, and have separate instances and kind of tie it in theory to your typical development workflow. So it's cool to see like the evolution of databases and features that make them more modern over the last several years.
Which is fascinating, because it's like databases are such an old concept. They've been around for like what, 50 years? And the fact that it's just a reinvention or a rethinking or retooling of something old becoming new.
Yeah, that is, I mean, that's it's kind of like development and engineering in a nutshell, right? Of like we're still just moving all the data around. We're just finding new abstractions, new ways to like work with it. But fundamentally, like the pieces that we're building are the same. You like go back to like, oh sorry, go ahead.
Oh no, sorry. Kind of as you were talking about, some of it is the developer experience. Like, how do you make this more pleasurable? Is a huge part of it.
Yeah, like how do you get that leverage, right? To like move faster by having better abstractions, for sure.
Which is gonna be one of our topics. So we talked about a lot of things beforehand. So developer experience. I'm particularly interested in like your experience with working at Twilio as one of the first 10 engineers. That's super cool. Twilio, I think, has always been kind of a big sibling to companies that I've worked at. Like we at Auth0 specifically, we looked at Twilio as like the company that was a few years ahead of us. That's where we want to be type thing. So I've always had a lot of respect for Twilio. I actually went and interviewed with them in person a couple years ago before joining Auth0, and they decided to go a different direction. I think it like went well, and I enjoyed it, but it didn't work out. But I've always been a big fan. And then to get into creating products and like finding use cases for developers and solving that with developer tools. So we've got kind of a wide array of topics that we can cover. So if people have specific questions, thoughts that you like to throw into the chat, please do that, and we'll bring those up and kind of help use that to influence some of the conversation that we have. Doctor in the chat is asking about thoughts on Directus. So it's kind of an interesting mix of like headless CMS and backend as a service, which is really cool. Like I don't have like super deep details into that, but I really enjoyed the time that I spent with it, and I imagine it's gotten even better in the last several months. So I'm a fan. I don't know if that's like super helpful response to that question, but I've definitely enjoyed it.
One thing I wanted to highlight that's going to seem random. I'll tell you my thought process here. We've had some friends from Directus on the podcast. So I was thinking about people that have been on. We thought about our sponsors. We have a sponsor or past sponsor that just announced they received $11 million in funding. So I wanted to give a shout out to Daily Dev because they had just a huge win. And I feel like right now in tech, those announcements are few and far between. So I'm going to say congratulations.
I'll have I'll give you a sneak peek that I will reference them at the end of the show as well. Cool. Are y'all ready to get started?
Let's do it.
Let's do it.
Sweet. Let me get music queued up. All right. Welcome everyone to another episode of Compressed FM, a podcast all about web development and design with a little bit of zest. In this episode, we're going to talk about developer experience, error messages, building products, solving problems, and all the things in between.
Web development and design, who would have guessed? Well, we can do them both, even add a little zest. So turn up the volume, get ready for the best. Let's get it started in this episode of Compressed.
What's up, everyone? My name is James Cuquick, and I am a full-time technical content creator.
Hello, my name is Amy Dutton, and I am the Director of Design at Zeal.
And we're excited to have Alan on as our guest today. Again, we've got lots of potential topics that we'll talk about, so we'll kind of see where it goes conversation-wise. But Alan, welcome to the show. Do you want to introduce yourself and tell people a little bit about your background?
Yeah, thanks so much. I'm Alan Shreve, Incontrivable on the internets, if you want to follow me. James, Amy, thank you so much for having me. It's a joy to be here. For those of you who don't know, I'm the founder and creator of ngrok. ngrok is a Ingress as a service platform. Lets you any developer put any of their applications on the internet and secure and accelerate them in a really easy way. So really excited to be here and talk about all things product building and developer experience.
Love it. And Amy, or both of you can kind of add in, but just specific example for people if they haven't used ngrok. ngrok is super popular. If they haven't used it before, Amy, you came across a use case like yesterday, I think. Do you want to explain people what you use ngrok for in that situation?
Yeah. So I have two use cases that I lean on ngrok for that are fantastic. So the first one, the one that James is referring to, is I was doing some work with Stripe, trying to do development. And one of the things that you do with Stripe is you have to have webhooks a lot of times to say, hey, this event happened on Stripe. I want to send that information over to, say, your website or a specific endpoint. And so if you're doing local development, that's all on localhost, you can't send Stripe to localhost. It doesn't know what that is. And so one of the great things about ngrok is it allows you to create a tunnel. So that's like, it gives it a URL that the world can access your individual server, your individual computer through this specific URL. And so what I can do is if you have a paid account, you can set up a subdomain. So you're locked into that particular URL. It's not generating a new one every time you run it, although there is a free plan. And so with Stripe, I can say, here's my endpoint, and then it'll help me be able to do all that development locally. And I can test to make sure that that's working correctly. The second use case that I'm a huge fan of is when I'm trying to do responsive work. Sometimes it's like, well, this is working on my machine. Why is it not working on this device or in this browser? Specifically, when you're talking about, say, like mobile development. So I'm building a website, I shrink down the page, but it's still not working on Safari on my iPhone. What's the problem? Well, if it's local development, that's hard. You can have a simulator on your computer, but that doesn't always mimic what's happening in reality. So I've set up ngrok to create that tunnel, and then I can just load up the browser on my phone, be able to check to make sure that everything's working correctly. So I use that one, that use case probably the most, but the Stripe integration piece is nice as well.
That's awesome. I also used it a lot when testing the functionality for the website for Compressed of auto-generating images. So when we input data into Sanity, save a record in Sanity, insets a webhook. And so I would use ngrok to run a URL locally that it could send the request back to. And sadly, I am cheaper than Amy. So what I did was stay on the free tier and just generated a new URL and then went into the Sanity dashboard and updated the URL each time.
Every time. Man.
But But that's certainly like a huge benefit of a paid tier is being able to have that consistent URL, so I don't have to do that. It would definitely speed up that process. Alan, are there any like, I feel like that's probably the most common use case is just like testing out webhooks. Are there any like additional details about that or any other features that are worth calling out for people?
Totally, yeah. Yeah, I mean, where that is really where ngrok started, and where like a large amount of developers find and use ngrok is doing webhook development or mobile testing, mobile development. Where we've moved ngrok really in the last year is about ngrok being generic ingress to any kind of service, regardless of whether it's running on your local machine or not. One of the things that we really saw was that's a really easy way to create ingress to your application to get traffic in from the internet doing local development. But as soon as you go to prod, you're like, well, now I have to go stand up a whole bunch of like infrastructure technology to like actually serve it. Like I have to start an API gateway, or I have to run a reverse proxy, or I have to like use some other services. And we wanted to bring that same simplicity of I just like run a command and my application is on the internet, and presumably like you should be able to do the same thing in development as you do in production. And so a lot of the work that we've done over the last year is about basically making that possible. And there are a whole like series of improvements and changes that we've made to allow people to put their services on the internet, both in production just as easily as they do it in development.
I feel like I first saw ngrok like many years ago, but I don't actually remember when that was. How long has ngrok been around?
ngrok has been around for a while. I wrote the first lines of code for it about 10 years ago, actually. Been working on it for a while.
Cool. Love that. I'm kind of curious, like just so there's like the perspective of getting into building products as an engineer, but like kind of leading up to that, I think I'm really interested in like your engineering experience. And you had on your notes one of the first 10 engineers at Twilio, which we talked about leading up to the episode as a company I'm particularly a big fan of, have been for a long time. Can you like one, I'm kind of curious like what it's like that early on at a company as an engineer, but just also just general experience that you have as an engineer?
Yeah. Working at Twilio in the early days was a really fun experience. It's we were one of the first companies that was really like driving developer experience as a selling point, and some a kind of a differentiator. So we spent a lot of time, and that's kind of one of the foundations of that I brought to ngrok was that focus on developer experience, and like building tools that developers, building tools and APIs and software that developers really love to use. So we spent a lot of time thinking about API design, a lot of time thinking about, how do we integrate into tools that developers are already using so that it feels really natural and simple to use the product. We were thinking about all of those things in the early days, for sure.
Do you have a specific process that you use when you're thinking about APIs? Like I've heard Taylor Otwell, who's behind Laravel, talk about how he always writes the API first as like almost a sentence, or this is what I would want it to do. And he writes the documentation for it. And then he goes in and actually writes the code to support it.
I do something similar, which is that one of the first things that I'm doing when I'm building developer products and APIs as well is I'm writing the code that's going to use it first, right? Or like the workflow that I want someone to actually like go through first to make sure that feels natural and feels simple. It is, I've definitely got myself into traps before where I've built APIs or tools and then like went to go use them and you're like, well, that's way too complicated, right? Like I wanted this to be like one line of code and it's like 5 to do this simple thing that I wanted. So kind of starting from, some people I think call this like README driven development, right? But basically like writing out like the actual usage and a couple like common like patterns that you're trying to actually build and enable first has been a really good forcing function for making sure that the developer experience that you land on in the end is really nailed well and that you've gotten it right.
I feel like you probably talk and reference developer experience more than you would have at Twilio, but it also sounded like that was a focus like in the early days of Twilio, just like being really cognizant of how are developers going to interact with this and making sure you're building stuff that is meant for a developer. And I think a lot of people in engineering just kind of miss that perspective for better or worse. It's just not something that they think about. It's just like, here's a task, go and build the task. And maybe it's easier to be that way at a bigger company because you're like, you've got 8 different levels of process that it comes to get prioritized to you as a developer. So at that point, you just like, you do the thing versus maybe at a smaller company, developers are also making decisions or recommendations on what they think is best for developers and use cases, et cetera. Do you think that you've like had more of a mind for that than the average developer? Just the way you talk about that, it seems more aware of the outside experience than what I would think the traditional person doing engineering would think about. Is that something you think about more than other people?
I don't know if I think about it more than other people. I would say that interestingly, as developers, when we are building software, we are very often, especially if we're working in any kind of team, building software that other developers are going to like work and interact with. And so one of the interesting things about being a software developer is that we are always like working on developer experience, right? Because someone else might maintain your code, right? Someone else is going to like take over the project and try to add something new. And so that fact that you're always thinking about who's going to like work with this piece next means that you're always thinking about that developer experience. In a very interesting way, like thinking about developer experience, like in your own code and in the products you build is really about like you're constantly doing essentially like product design, right? Like that is essentially like thinking about how someone else is going to consume the thing that you're doing is kind of a very fundamental like product design piece. And so that's it's interesting that as developers we're kind of always doing that, even if we're not working explicitly on developer tools.
So going from engineering at Twilio, do you want to like? I'm really curious just on like the backstory of ngrok. Was that a problem that you found at Twilio that like a tool like this is missing and we need something like that for our workflow? And then you went out and maybe spend some nights and weekends working on something and then got to the point where you're like, hey, this could be an actual product that I like do full time, for example. What was like the discovery phase like? What was the validation phase like? And then how was the process to decide like this is something I want to build out and do full time?
Twilio was, I mean, my experience at Twilio was definitely one of the motivating factors for building ngrok. It was one of the pains that I experienced while I was there. And, after I left, I was building, I've always been a tinker and building toy projects and things on the side. And, one of the problems that I had as a developer at Twilio, I was building the SMS layer that handled all the text messages there. Was we basically like I would like sit with like a phone next to my laptop and like type in a text message and then press it like over and over again to like do development to like see text messages go through. And you're like, well, that's a really silly process. Like I shouldn't be doing that. There's got to be something that's better to receive these callbacks. There were existing tools out there and that solved the problem. And so I was basically like taking an existing tool that solved that problem. The particular one that I was kind of used as a base was called Local Tunnel by my friend Jeff Lindsay, and had like kind of rebuilt it and kind of like started adding a whole bunch of features to it, and then ngrok kind of like took off in a very different direction.
Did you have like a pretty substantial user base, I guess, like while you were working on that part-time? Like how long did you work at Twilio and do that part-time before making the decision to kind of leave and go all in?
Oh, I was building ngrok after I had left Twilio. I left for other reasons. Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah.
I think products are so much better and stronger when you can start with a pain point, especially when it's like your own pain point that you're like, I know exactly what the use case is. I know exactly what the developer experience needs to be because I've experienced the pain.
It's one of the joys of working on, there are many joys of working on developer products. And it's a place where I'm like super motivated and comfortable and really happy to be there. But one of them certainly is that you get to scratch your own itch and solve your own problems and really like empathize with the customer without, by like being the customer, right? Like you're consuming the things that you're building. So it's a really fun place for me to be. it's not always true that that loop is so tight, right? You're often like, for other kinds of software, you're always like going out into the world and saying like, did they build the right thing? And so it's nice to have that like loop kind of like sit all in your head.
Were there, I think a lot of developers, a lot of us think like, oh, it'd be cool to build a product one day and make millions of dollars and do all these things. But like what? Yeah, right. But what we like don't think about, I think at some point, is all the things that go into like building a product. That's not just doing development, like actually growing a product, building a community, like all these things. Are there any like particular aspects of like building a business and a brand that were particularly interesting or challenging, or maybe stuff that you like didn't think about a lot before kind of going all in?
Oh my God. I mean, there's
Such a good question.
Like
Everything. Yeah.
What isn't part of that? Yeah. Yeah. I mean, when you like really start taking your development tool and start turning it into when you take like a project that you've built and start turning it into a business, you start thinking about all of the other things, right? You start thinking about marketing, you start thinking about design and presentation, about a whole bunch of things that in a pure development standpoint you wouldn't be. And there are challenges everywhere from like, how do I communicate this well to the world? How do I differentiate it from other things that are out in the marketplace, to the very, very mundane of like, how do I set up a business entity and like what taxes do I have to pay and like all sorts of things, right? So it really runs the full gamut of the things that you get exposed to.
How big is your team?
ngrok is we're a little over 70 people right now.
Really? Oh, I had no idea. That's awesome. So how long did it take? Like, how long were you writing code by yourself before you hired your first employee?
I worked on ngrok by myself for quite a long time. Really started growing the team first in early 2019 is about when we started building the team.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I was gonna say, do you feel like you've made it, or is there still like a point in your head where you're like, once I get here, we arrived?
I don't know what made it really means or feels like. For me, like I am always chasing like building the next amazing like experience that I want to deliver to developers. And right now that is, where we started was like making this like webhook development flow easy. And now, the mode that I'm in is like developers, when they're like putting their applications, like the gap between I have something that runs on my laptop and like works locally and like I have a production service, it is far too large for my taste. It's a really frustrating like experience to like take something and go from like it works locally to it works in production, right? There are just like a whole bunch of different technologies that you have to wrap around your project to make it ready. And I'm really excited about like delivering that experience to developers where it does not feel harder, right? That you basically like wrap ngrok around your application and it starts taking care of a whole bunch of things in production that you otherwise would have had to build yourself, right? Looking for that kind of like superpower of like, I don't have to worry about these things because the thing that I've like, when I wrapped ngrok around my application, it takes care of those things for me.
Going back to the like, do you feel like you made it question? I think there's like, for me, there are like major milestones, and you kind of look like leading up to the major milestone. You're like, oh, can you imagine if I did this or if I did that? And I've hit like lots of those in my career, but it doesn't like, I still just continue to like look forward to bigger and bigger milestones. So I think your reaction there was like very similar to how I interpret things in my career, where if like some of the things that I do now 5-6 years ago, that would have been like, oh, you made it type thing. But it's always like, you're always kind of looking for building the next thing, going to the next level, like whatever the scalability of a thing is, or learning a new skill set. I certainly understand the tiers and goals and working towards those.
You always want to be growing.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, absolutely. There's a question in the chat about VC. So did you go through like public funding, or I don't know if public is the right word, but did you go through like a funding round to get money, or like what did that process look like?
Yeah, public funding would be like an IPO, right?
Yeah. Again, I don't think that was the right word, but
yeah. So Ngrok was a bootstrapped company for a very long time. We actually took our very first investment of capital this last year.
oh, exciting.
So yeah, that was
Yeah.
our very first raise. We raised $50 million at the very end of
Wow.
last year. Really built out-
Congratulations.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah.
Oh, hold on. Pause. Pause. Wait for it. Where is it? Rats.
Oh, this better
You
be
got
good,
a
James.
soundboard?
Yeah, he does.
Yeah.
Okay, good.
He
has
has
He has this one that's like a very polite golf clap. And I was afraid he was going to do that one where I was like, when you're talking, there you go. I was like,
He's
that's
so
not worth
snarky.
$50 million, you know?
Yeah, so we're really
if it was
excited.
60, you would have gotten the bigger one. Just
I see, okay, fair enough. Yeah, next time. So I had bootstrapped the business up until last year. Really just like
Wow.
focused on building for customers, building for revenue. And now we're off chasing something bigger and really excited to be building towards that grander vision.
Was
That's amazing.
if this is an awkward question, you can decline to answer. Was there something that made you think, oh, we should get funding now? Like, was there a change mentally versus like we've bootstrapped it for so long, we're just going to keep bootstrapping?
Yeah, there are two things that like really motivated the raise. One is just like the kind of like overwhelming demand for Ngrok across all of our customers, right? We were just really starting to hit a scale where we weren't really able to keep up with all of the customers who were coming in, the feature requests that were pouring in. So really excited to like have the capital to go chase a lot of those additional ambitions. And the second part was really like our vision, right, of like what we wanted Ngrok to become and the scale of what we wanted to build it towards. So those are both like and with the business at the size it was, we really to like chase that really need to bring on more hands to like help build.
Mm-hmm.
It's so incredible. Like thinking about myself, individual person, developer, and then thinking about the potential to be the creator of a product that then goes and has 10, 50, 100 scalable employees, like going through millions of dollars of funding. It's just, I think it's so inspiring. I think that's the coolest thing about being a developer is you have the ability to go and build products and solve problems in a way that like most people in the world don't. Like there's obviously a physical aspect of products for many things, but with software you can solve a lot of problems, and basically all of us have the ability to do it from a code perspective. And then I think your mindset on like product development and developer focus and all those things like ultimately lead to a successful product. There's a question in the chat, and I'm kind of curious too, size wise. So up until funding, what was the size of the company like? And then like post funding, I assume that's grown probably a fairly significant amount.
Yeah, we'd made it to about a little under 30 pre-funding, so something like that. You're just responding to what you said before. You're 100% right. It's another thing that's like just a real blessing in the software industry is that the barrier to entry is so low, right? In terms of the resources that are available like on the internet to teach and to help you get there, to like build a product, as well as the actual like upfront capital investment to start building a product is really quite low as well compared to other industries, right? If you're building like medical devices or something like that, right? there's a lot more capital and like upfront cost, and we're in like a very like blessed world in software that we can like start with so little. Ngrok actually, like the very first versions of Ngrok ran on like a $20 a month like BPS, right? Of like just starting like really tiny, and that's a really amazing place to be.
I was listening to a podcast this morning, and it was just a good reminder because they were saying, in the past, like hundreds of years ago, the like kings and queens, the elite people of the world had access to more technology, like higher levels of technology than the peasants. It was saying like now you probably have the same phone in your pocket that Elon Musk has. And that's like mind blowing to me that the person that's trying to put some people on Mars and is trying to drive like self-driven cars has the same technology and the same access that I do, which is just, really exciting that we're empowered that way.
Absolutely.
The world of tech is pretty incredible.
Yep. Yep. And I know like there are people that are so scared right now because of ChatGPT and Open AI and all this stuff. Like, what's going to happen to our jobs? But I just look at them like there is so much opportunity right now. Like,
Mhm.
it's so awesome just to be alive and part of everything that's going on right now.
Someone commented, we're taking this a little bit different direction, but following
Yeah.
the AI piece. Someone mentioned on Twitter, like they kind of thought they look at like AI as taking away our creativity. And there's like, I get that perspective of like, it's we're not having to think as much because it's thinking for us type thing. But for me, like I've gone to ChatGPT multiple times to spark creativity. Like I've asked
Mhm.
it, like, what are some demos that I could build for this concept that I want to teach on a YouTube video, or what are some features that I could incorporate into an application, like whatever it is. To me, I look at it as like the ultimate creativity assist because it's going to be able to
Mhm.
give me ideas and things that I didn't think about, and then it's still up to me. I was gonna say to go and build the thing, but like maybe it's up to me and ChatGPT to build the thing because it can still help me out there. But I definitely use it as a source of inspiration myself.
Well, at least the consumer side of it, we don't have access to like a computer graphic of James recording the video,
Yeah,
It's like you can just feed it that, but who knows? That might be in the
there actually
future.
there actually is like a deep fake video generator thing, I
Ooh.
think. So we joked about this in a Discord that I'm in with Chris Ev and Otto, who built VideoTap, which you give it a YouTube video
That's
and
how
it
you got the inside track.
yeah, yeah. Well, I'm fairly close with them.
Yeah, I know.
But we so sorry. VideoTap takes, you give it a YouTube video and it generates a blog post from it using AI. So it does summary and like headings and code snippets and all kinds of stuff, which is really, really good. And somebody joked like, all right, now the next tool is you go the other way and you take a blog post and generate
Yeah.
a video with YouTube like of me. And then someone shared a link. I haven't looked at the details, but like there's a deep fake like video thing that you could, if you got it, I'm sure there's enough video of me on YouTube that people could generate a deep fake, which I should not encourage people to do because that could get really scary, but probably could be done.
Um, Maybe
I'm sure it's going to be done in our lifetimes.
Yes.
Like
Yep.
pretty quickly here. Like that
Mhm.
tech is moving pretty quick.
Nivi in the chat was saying that you could clone your voice. It's quite expensive though.
Yeah.
So what's interesting is Descript, which is a platform that we use or I use to edit videos and edit the podcast. You record like 2 or 3 pages of you reading something, and then you can like write text and it'll say it like in your voice. So my husband was working on a video where he needed to replace something, and so he was asking me like, "Can we have this replaced?" And it was somebody screaming. And I was like, "The thing is with the script right now, you have to read 2 or 3 pages that match the
Mhm.
volume and intonation of that." And he was like,
Yeah.
"Oh goodness." So it'd have to be somebody
Yelling.
just screaming excitedly for
I volunteer. I'll do it.
Oh man.
All right, I'm gonna take
I was like,
us,
steer us back, James.
which I feel like that, again, like Amy and I think both have gotten really into the AI conversation. But from a technical perspective, do you mind sharing like any underlying technologies, languages, frameworks, tools, architectures, like any of that from a technical perspective on ngrok? Like, what are the developers, the infrastructure people? What are the things that they're using behind the scenes? I'd love to hear more about that.
Yeah, totally. ngrok is written like internally, primarily in Go. There is a little bit of
cool.
Rust, but almost all of our backend services are written in either Go or Rust. The vast majority of them being written in Go. Our front end is TypeScript, so a full like React TypeScript bit. The rest of it, I don't know. There's too many other like interesting like technology decisions. One of the things that I internalized a long while ago from I think it was Etsy who was a big proponent of this. They had like a big philosophy around basically like using boring technologies, right? Right, of like you like when you're building something new, like the last thing that you want to be working with tools that you're comfortable with, like things that you are proficient in, and things that are well trod, right? Like that have been like vetted by the ecosystem and like work really well. because you are taking a bet on the product, right? And so like there's a whole like set of unknowns and just like building something new, where like you want as few new things that you have to like work with as you can reasonably get away with. So we try to like stick with, not adopting too many new pieces or new technologies. There are a few places where we do make those bets, where we find that yes, it is like the existing tooling is not good enough and we need to like do something new. So a good example of that is that our development environment is actually fully defined in Nix, which is maybe like a little bit more well adopted these days. But back when we started doing it was definitely like kind of more on the forefront of people experimenting with that. But most of the other things we try to keep pretty boring. So Go, Rust, TypeScript on the front end. We use gRPC internally to talk between all of our services, and Kubernetes to like run our services in production.
Cool. So interesting that you kind of went on the description of the boring stuff, because I'm not well versed in this, so my opinion doesn't matter that much. But my initial reaction was the opposite when you mentioned Rust and Go. Like those still feel to me like newer languages. I would imagine like worldwide adoption at bigger companies is not that large. Again, I have no idea if that's actually true. That's just my initial thought. So I feel like that's like a newer one. And then there's also a question in the chat that I'm curious that you must have, I would assume, like writing in Rust and Go was also relatively new. So when was that adoption? And then what did you use for your API services before using Rust and Go?
Yeah. I guess what I would say is boring is relative.
Yeah,
right?
absolutely.
And like what I mean by that is like it should be boring for you, like the developer of
Yep.
like something that you are proficient in and that you have a lot of experience in, because ultimately like that's there is a piece of it of like how boring is it in the ecosystem, because that kind of correlates to how battle tested something is, right? But there is another piece, which is how boring it is for you. And that is more a reflection of your proficiency, like how well you have your hands around the tool and how quickly you can move with it. So, those are, pieces of technologies where, when I was building this, I was like, I'm already comfortable with this sort of thing, right? So I can like leverage these tools. Or, now that ngrok is a bigger team, it is the engineers on the team who are more comfortable with a particular technology, like that kind of determines whether it's boring or not.
That's perfect. Yeah, I love that.
Yeah. I think I didn't answer the question, which was about what was ngrok written in beforehand. So ngrok actually like started out in Go. So that was maybe less of a boring choice when I first made it.
It's bold.
I would think so. Yeah. Wow.
But
you said that was 10 years ago, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Didn't know Go was around 10 years ago.
I know.
That's wild.
Yeah.
That's cool.
But the web application that like handled all of like the sign up and authentication and stuff like that, that was all Python, which was a very boring choice for me at the moment, or at that time, and eventually like kind of like unified the whole thing into Go eventually.
Cool.
Yeah.
That's so interesting. Yeah, I mean, especially 10 years ago, again, I didn't think Go was around, so you must have been an early adopter at that point. I know.
There are, like I said, there are times where you like do want to take those bets on like new things. And at the time,
was one.
It was one bet that was for a particular type of project like ngrok, which is very networking heavy application. The choices for like well adopted languages at the time to like build that kind of product were not great. So Go was really the best choice at the time for that, for me personally, right?
Yeah.
Again, like all of these things are they're
relative.
A lot of relative to like who the builder is. I don't like to say any of these things in general.
You also mentioned Kubernetes. That wasn't around 10 years ago, right?
Also a new adoption as well, right? So like that was sorry, what I mean is like that's something that we did much later once it had been well adopted by the ecosystem.
I was in the dark.
Yeah, no, like that transition was maybe 3 years ago, 2 years ago, something like that. So a relatively recent one. Before that, ngrok was, again, like very boring technology choices of like copy your executables to servers and tell them to like run under like a process supervisor, right? So like
and there
Yeah, and
Yep.
and those are great places, especially when you're like building new things, building proof of concepts. Like the fewer like new stuff, the fewer new choices that you have to make. Um, not too far away from like SFTP drag and drop, not exactly, but like like Ansible to like copy a thing over to like a server. It wasn't too much more complicated than that in the early days.
I've got several questions. Like the technology pieces really excite me. So I'm curious, the other things that you use, databases, if you don't mind sharing. Like, where do you deploy Kubernetes, if you don't mind sharing? And then also, are there any? I think one topic that like seems to be, at least in my experience, super prevalent in like bigger software is like queues, message queues, but they never. I feel like they never get mentioned and referenced in when we build demo stuff, which we just don't need it at that point. So it makes sense. But I feel like it's kind of like this big, like asynchronous architecture is kind of a missing piece of stuff you just don't learn about until you actually get into what you're doing. So if you have anything, I don't know if you use anything with messages and asynchronous architecture, curious about that. Also, just like database where you host, love to know any details you have around all that.
Yeah. Again, like a bunch of boring choices. We run our software on Amazon. Our database is Postgres for all of it. And the message queue we use is Kafka. So a bunch of like pretty industry standard choices.
Fairly
not trying
standard.
to, like, reinvent the wheel there.
Yeah. I think it's good for people to hear that too, though, because these are all attainable words and technologies for people of like even entry level development skills. Like as you go through tutorials, it's likely that you would have used Postgres somewhere. It's likely that you, like if you were getting into infrastructure early on, you would have learned how to set up Kubernetes and deploy a cluster, or just the basics of like an individual container. So I feel like relating something that is successful, and that's all obviously relative, but you're here now running your own company, like it's very successful, relating that back, or just having people be able to hear those technologies referenced at that level gives them, I would think, kind of like motivation of like, hey, I'm actually learning about things that are pretty real world that could scale.
Yeah. Like I said, boring choices for you. Like the things that you're comfortable with, especially in the early days, are really good. Once you start to scale and you're saying like, cool, like we know what the problem is, we know exactly like what we're building and how to go to like the next, like what we need to build next. That's when you can start making like those larger bets of saying, well, maybe like the existing technologies are clumsy for the thing that we're trying to do, and like let's try experimenting with something new.
That's such a challenge to me because a lot of times I'm like, I want to learn that new technology, so I'm going to put my new project on that thing.
Yeah.
Or like I'll have an idea and I'm like, this is a great excuse to stick this on whatever.
Here's the thing though, is like it really depends on your goals, right? If your goal is like I'm gonna go learn a new technology, like you should definitely go do that,
Mhm.
right? But if your goal is like I want to go build a new product, right? Then maybe you like make a different set of choices.
Mhm.
But again, right, like we're always optimizing for things that make ourselves happy, right? So like you really have to be like in that mode. For me personally, I try to put myself in that mode of like, what is it that I want to get out of this? Like, do I
Mhm.
want to learn a new technology? Do I want to like build a new product? And like, what's my like best path to like try to optimize over that kind of like utility curve?
And I think Amy, you would probably make a more educated, based on experience, decision for tech stack if it was something you were like thinking about building long term, not just as a
Mhm.
learning opportunity,
Yeah,
right?
that's
Like
true.
as much as I love SvelteKit, if I were building something that I thought was like a longer term bet, like I'd probably go Next.js. It's been around
Mhm.
longer. I think it
Mhm.
has more behind it, and maybe even go back to like a regular full node backend. Like I may even go back that far if I was building something fully myself. So I think like obviously the purpose of what you're building influences those decisions. But Amy and I both love to have new demos to be able to try out new things on a consistent, probably too consistent basis.
But
Yeah.
like in the Jamstack ecosystem, well, I mean, we're talking about anything really, but specifically Jamstack. It's like shiny new tool, squirrel.
Mhm.
Did you hear this thing? There's tons of packages that you're always integrating. I mean, that's I feel like what my news feed is. And
Mhm.
so this is such an interesting topic to be like, boring is good.
Mm-hmm.
So, speaking of shiny new demos, do you guys want to see one?
Yes.
Yeah,
yes, yes.
absolutely.
All right, cool.
We
so
may just the editing note.
We might have
actually,
to
we
either
may have
cut
to
this section out, or we need to be very descriptive.
Yeah. So the context for this is like, obviously people can see now. With the podcast after the fact, they won't be able to see. So maybe we can make a decision, but if you can try to be as descriptive as possible with what you're showing, then we'll try to keep it in the audio version.
And we
Alright.
can link out to it in the show notes if we need
Yeah.
to.
So the video. Yeah,
Mhm.
good point.
Let's try it. So the demo that I'm going to do is it's going to be really quick. Basically, we have the ngrok. If you've used ngrok before, you've like downloaded an agent, right? You downloaded like a executable onto your machine,
Mhm.
and then you ran a command and pointed at a port of something that you wanted to put on the internet. One of the things that we've been doing lately is moving ngrok to something that you can embed directly into your applications themselves. So I'm going to demo that for you pretty quickly
Ooh,
here.
so exciting.
So let's take a look at an Express application, actually. So let me present here. Bunch of warnings about screen sharing. How about an entire screen? There we go.
The main thing is just don't show your environment variables. Other than that,
Sure, yeah. Can folks see this? It looks like you can. Let's see if we can
Wait,
make this
actually,
bigger.
is it showing up on the stream? It's not,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
Wait, really?
Yeah.
Like on the main window, it's like not showing up for me.
That's strange.
Looks right for me.
Works right in my computer. Maybe we should generate an ngrok tunnel for you to be able to see.
That's what we're gonna do. That's what we're gonna do.
Wait, why am I the only one out of us and the chat that can't see this?
I don't know.
What? No, it's Nibby saying it's visible.
No, I
And
know. I'm saying I'm
Okay.
literally the only one out of us three
You're
and the
special,
entirety of
Dean.
chat.
You're special.
No, not in a good way though. This sucks. Okay, well, y'all have
Can you
fun.
not even
Well,
see
continue.
it? Can you not even see it in your separate? Do you have YouTube and Twitch pulled up?
I'll pull up
Do you want the
the.
stream in a different
Yeah, you'll
in a different
delayed
tab?
version.
Jeez Louise. For what it's worth, StreamYard, this is like one thing that I've never seen before that is making me sad because usually it's so good. But continue, fun people that get to see everything.
Cool. So I'm looking at an Express application right now. All that I did here was I installed I did npm init before this and installed Express and the ngrok package. That's it. And then I've got the tiniest Express app ever, right? That just says hello compressed FM.
Awesome.
And then the thing below it, right, is basically normally you are used to setting up Express to serve on a local port. Instead, what I'm doing here is I've basically imported the ngrok package and told it to listen on every one of ngrok's edges around the world. So we run edge servers all around the world, right? Points of presence that we call them. And so instead of listening on a local port, you're getting back essentially the same listener object that you would get otherwise from listening on a local port and handing it to Express to be served on. So that's basically what we're doing we are connecting to ngrok, and then we're asking for an HTTP endpoint called compressedfm.ngrok.app, and then telling the Express server to listen on it. So if we go over to another tab here and just run that program, see it says it is online. This is live, by the way, so folks on stream, if you want to try going to that
cool.
URL, you will actually be online. So you don't have to download or run anything else. It just exists on the internet. So this is what I was talking about building that kind of these next primitives to make it easier in both development and production to really get ingress to your application really quickly.
What? That's so cool.
That's awesome. Yeah,
Thank you.
Awesome.
That's
I'll give
such
you
Yeah.
that's such
Oh,
a
yeah.
perfect fit. For exactly all the things that you've been saying, that seems like such a perfect fit.
Thank you. I'll give you one other quick demo going back to the code here. Is one of the things that I mentioned was, we're talking about building pieces that take things off developers' plates, right? So that you don't have to build additional resiliency primitives, acceleration primitives into your application. When you put something online, you start asking your questions about like, how do I protect it? How do I secure it? How do I log it? Right? Like all of these, pieces that you tend to wrap around your application. And at ngrok, we want to make those just so much easier for you to get, right? Where you should basically just declare that I want these things to be in front of my application and not have to set up necessarily like additional infrastructure. So one of the examples that I'm going to give here is I'm going to go into this, the line of code that says I want the domain to be compressedfm.ngrok.app and add another line of code here. And let's say that I want to put GitHub OAuth authentication in front of it. So I've just got .oauth and I pass it like the provider that I want. So let's say it's GitHub, and we'll run this again. And then hopefully I'm in an incognito window. I'm not, maybe. So maybe I'm already logged into GitHub. So let's open this back up in a different incognito window so that it actually theoretically like throws me through GitHub flow here. Yeah, you can see. So now it's like fronted
nice.
by GitHub authentication. You can do the same thing with Google or other like
Too easy.
authentication pieces.
Wow.
Right. So like developers shouldn't have to build these things. You should be able to just simply ask for them and have them happen for you. So we have other primitives like rate limiting and circuit breaking and load balancing and things like that that you can just ask for. But hopefully that's a good example of like something that you can just do really quickly, and the kind of like places the developer experience, right? Like pulling it back to like, how do we like make this one line to add the authentication that we want in front? So that's the quick demo.
That's really pretty wild. There's a question that I also have. How does the project know it can use the given like subdomain? I assume like you just like it would tell you if that subdomain is already being used, basically.
That's exactly right. Yeah. Okay. We also like, there is an ngrok dashboard where if you want to bring your own domain, you can definitely go set that up.
Okay. Wow.
Here's Google authentication instead, where we just change the string to Google.
That's crazy.
Do I have like the right window here?
This is what I'm talking about. It's exciting to be in tech.
Absolutely.
That's my very quick demo. I hope that was enjoyable for people.
Yeah.
Incredibly.
So the way this works is basically like the underlying thing is a big ngrok app. Like so you've registered the ngrok app with all these different providers. You enable this, and they're basically logging into your app, which is sitting in front of the actual code that they're trying to get to. Is that right at a high level?
So what's going on at a high level is you've imported our like SDK into your application. When you run your application, it is basically reaching out to ngrok's essentially like distributed system. Like you can think of it as like a distributed load balancer or distributed reverse proxy, right? Our global service there. And basically when it reaches out, it says, I would like authentication in front of my app. And so that's transmitted to our service. It gets replicated globally to all of our points of presence, which reload all of themselves to know that you want to listen on this domain with these authentication primitives. And then when the request comes in for the authentication bit, for example, it says you wanted Google OAuth. So it knows to basically like check to see if someone has authenticated it, and if not, throw them through that Google OAuth flow. There were a couple of questions in there in the comments, and I'll try to answer some of them. Someone was asking, how does the project authenticate? Yes, you maybe saw in the code there was like a get your authentication from the environment. So I already set an environment variable with essentially like what we call the ngrok auth token or API key, which allows it to authenticate to ngrok and know which account you're working with.
Cool. It's so neat because I think it's easy with a product like ngrok. Like it's just been such a specific thing of I want to have a webhook, call my local running thing. And it's easy to like limit ourselves mentally of like, that's what ngrok is. So it's really cool for me to be able to see like, this is not all that different from that, but the features on top of it and adding the functionality that just makes sense in a developer workflow. I'm glad we were able to get to that point and like actually see that once I open a new window of like what that actually looks like.
Yeah, totally. I'm really glad that I got to show you that. On that webhook thing, like we've also added primitives around that as well. So like if you're doing webhook development, you can basically tell us like I'm handling Stripe webhooks and give us a API key, or sorry, the Stripe signing secret. and ngrok will actually do all of that webhook authentication and verification for you, so you don't have to like
Cool.
figure out how to
Oh,
like verify
yeah.
that the messages came from
From
Stripe,
Stripe.
Twilio, or Slack, or
Yeah.
anything like that. Essentially, that gets pushed out to our global edge, and we run that functionality for
That's
you
awesome.
too.
Interesting. So you have the
Yeah.
ability to potentially just like, I don't know if it's phrased this way or if it's designed this way, but basically like a plugin ecosystem potentially of like, here's the different things you may want to integrate with. We may have a plugin where you have one less step to worry about.
That's exactly right. So all of this is about like, how do we make it easier to get these things online? How do we
Yeah.
like take care of these security and authentication primitives? I saw there were a couple questions in the chat. We just this week made the OAuth feature and the webhook verification feature. We just put them into our free tier. So
Cool.
if you want to like run those OAuth pieces up to, I think it's 5 users, we've got it set at that can like authenticate through for free. And for webhook verification, we have like a number of webhooks that you can verify for free. But all
That's awesome.
that has been moved into the free tier. We want to make sure that adding security, adding authentication is something that's really easy and transparent for developers to do.
So cool.
Yeah, that is super exciting. If there's, hopefully this is obvious, but as those features and things roll out, if there's stuff that Amy and I could do, I'll volunteer myself. I don't know about Amy to share, retweet, or just to help kind of get the.
Oh, I thought you were
awareness,
going to
'cause again-
ask for the beta release
Oh no,
and get another sash.
no, I was gonna sneak my way into a paid account. Just kidding.
I see.
But I would like if there's tweets and stuff that go out that I can help share and maybe Amy as well. Like I'd love to, because I think that's the exposure that just makes all the difference
Mhm.
in the world
Yeah.
is people just knowing like what a product is capable of doing that they may not have known about before.
I appreciate that. One of the things that I definitely ask you for that, but the thing that I'll also ask you for is that like this JavaScript SDK. So we just released the Go one a couple weeks ago.
Mhm.
We have the Rust one that we're about to release in the next week or two,
Cool.
and JavaScript
Okay,
is
announcements.
what kind of like in development.
Okay.
So we're still like iterating on that API, and would love your feedback on the API design, right?
Yeah.
That's something that we're like
Done.
rapidly iterating on and really want to like dial in the developer experience. So
Cool.
and
This
we love
is
talking to people in the community to understand like, does
Yeah.
it like we do that
Does it
like
make
README
sense?
driven development first, right? Of like, this is how we
Mhm.
think it works. But then like the next step of that is always like, take it to other people. Like, how does
Mhm.
it, how fast is that? Or, how did they perceive the experience, right? Because
Yep.
you can get caught in your own like loops of how you think
Of
the
how you
developer
think, yeah.
experience is supposed to be.
absolutely.
Mhm.
If I do, I've been doing like weekly streams with a guest to more hands-on than this one. So if we'd be interested in doing that in a few weeks to just try it out together. And then there's a question in the chat, or a comment in the chat of like free swag. Maybe I'm not putting you on the spot, but like if we had stickers or something to give away for people that like participated in watching the stream or something, we could talk about that. But I'd love
I would
to.
love to do that. I'll
Yeah.
talk to the team about that.
Cool. I've also got like, I think we should wrap up, but as we've talked more, I've gotten more and more questions, but I'll refrain and maybe we'll have like more conversations later on. But this
Sure.
is super cool.
I know we need to wrap up, but do you want to say
But-
anything about writing great error messages? Or do we want to just change the title?
We could do both. Yeah, what time is it? I gotta go pretty quickly here.
Okay,
Um,
I tell you what.
I guess like I can give you like a very brief like little bit about error messages.
Okay,
which is,
I'm gonna set you up for it, okay? And
All
give
right,
like a
let's do it.
2-minute thing. Okay. So James, one of the things that you like to do a lot of times is a soapbox topic. So I believe one of Alan's soapbox topics is writing great error messages. So Alan, why is that important to you?
Yeah, that's a great setup. It is a soapbox for the exact same reason that I care so deeply about developer experiences, is that error messages are a key part of developer experience, right? Like when you are building a product, especially a developer product, like you are, as a developer, you're always trying to like, you never get it right the first time, right? Like whether you're working, like you're building a compiler or it's not building a compiler, you're trying to like write something and like running it through the compiler, trying to like see, does it work? You're getting back, you're always doing it wrong. And like the tools are telling you like, you did this wrong, your type's wrong, you didn't specify the right variable, you missed something. And those error messages are the thing that like direct you to what's right. And so the quality of like how fast someone can adopt your tool, how quickly they can get to correct, depends on the quality of the error message that you deliver. So that's my soapbox for like why they're so important. And the other like bit of the soapbox is everyone like forgets them in product design. Like in product design, you're always like, what is the user will click on this and then they'll do this and it'll be great. But you're like, what if they clicked on the wrong thing? And like that's so rarely like a top of mind product consideration. What if they like typed the wrong thing? How do we make sure that they get to the correct solution? So that's my soapbox for why error design is so important. And then, you know, I've like kind of like built a mental checklist of like what makes a good error message, which I'm not sure that we have time to like go through it, but there are good examples of this abound in the ecosystem of like the Rust compiler is one that has definitely taken this to heart of like trying to surface to you. I guess maybe I'll do a little bit of the checklist, which is like trying to surface to you like exactly where the error occurred, right? Or like trying to suggest to you what you might have meant, like how you may want to go about fixing it, right? An error message that doesn't direct you to try to take some kind of action is not helpful. At ngrok, one of the things that we do for error messages is we basically every user-facing error in the entire system, anything, if you see an error back from ngrok, it has a unique error code in it. And that's tremendously important for people to be able to Google, right? Because like what we do as developers is we see an error and we're like, who else on the internet had this problem? Like, how did they solve it? And so we wanted some unique string that you could plug into Google and find anyone else who had that problem, as well as create documentation ourselves that would show up that would help you understand any more rich thing that we can maybe surface in like a web browser or a terminal, you know, how to solve the problem. So we make sure that everything has a unique error code, essentially a unique URL that exists on the internet that describes the error.
That's brilliant.
There's a lot of considerations that go into like making sure that that's a great experience for developers to be able to like solve their problems quickly.
I love that. I saw a tweet yesterday, and I don't know if he was just trying to stir up drama, but they were like, I don't know why people use bug trackers. Like that's such an anti-pattern because you just shouldn't write bugs at all. I was like people are human. I know, it's like people are human. It's not like we intentionally plant bugs in our code. It just happens. And so I love this other response of like kind programming for yourself so that when you do hit that wall, you do hit the problem, there's like documentation around that. You're helping yourself out to be able to locate the bug to be able to squash it.
Yeah, it also like helps us internally, right? Because when people write into ngrok and say like I've had a problem, they send us that error code, right? So we can basically know exactly the line of code that they hit
that's
of
brilliant.
like where they had it, as opposed to before that, you know, we would have people who write in and say like it doesn't work when I do this, and we're like, I have no idea like where it is that you like ran into a problem, but when you write in, you're like, it's this exact string, you know exactly the problem that they're running into, and it helps make diagnosing those customer problems and getting customers to success way faster.
That's awesome.
That's great. Yeah. I think time wise, we probably need to skip. We'll skip picks and plugs, which means everybody listening will have to wait another week for amazing picks and plugs. So there's the teaser there.
But check out ngrok.
Yes. Check out ngrok.
I think I've plugged it enough already.
I know,
so let's get that.
That's the point though, is like giving people a platform to have conversations, share their story, and also share the things that they work on. And I got like, I think progressively more and more excited about the conversation as we learn more and dug in more. So I really appreciate you joining us and taking us through this, and hope you enjoyed it as well. But thanks for coming on.
It's been such a pleasure. Amy, James, thank you so much for having me.
Of course.
All right. If you're listening in your podcatcher, make sure to leave a rating and review to help us continue to have more amazing guests on Compressed. In the meantime, that's all we got. Official end of the recording.
I know. In our second goodbye, I just want to shout out the chat. You guys have been fantastic today in terms of supplying great questions and feedback. So it makes this entire experience what it is by having your participation.
Yeah, seriously. Thank you for all the great questions and comments and feedback. Really appreciated it.
Cool. All right. We'll go ahead and actually like end the stream. But thanks again, Alan and everybody in the chat for being here.